When did a fortune tempt you to turn your back on them? The day started like any other, a lukewarm cup of instant coffee clutched in my hand, the faint scent of stale cereal hanging in the air of our cramped living room. But then the email arrived, innocent-looking enough in my inbox, and suddenly every compromise I had ever made, every sacrifice I had ever quietly swallowed, stood before me in stark, unavoidable relief. A fortune, they said, enough to change everything. And my first thought, the one that hit me before the joy or the shock, was a chilling question. Could I really finally turn my back on them, on Ryan, on Carolyn, on Marie? The weight of that question felt like a physical pressure squeezing the air from my lungs. I remember that morning vividly. It was a Tuesday, already shaping up to be a typical grind. William Petrov, 37M, was a creature of habit, mostly because habit was cheaper than spontaneity. My shared living space, a 3-bedroom house in a perpetually up-and-coming part of town, was less a home and more a holding pattern for dreams that had long since lost altitude. For the past 5 years, it had been my refuge, my prison, and the crucible for a family dynamic I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. My flatmates were, in a word, demanding. First, there was Ryan Harris, 60M, my uncle by marriage, though the marriage itself had dissolved decades ago. He was a relic, a man who believed the world owed him a living and was perpetually on the cusp of his next big break. Ryan had moved in after his latest business venture. I use the term loosely imploded, leaving him with nothing but a mountain of debt and a charming, if completely unfounded, optimism. He was all about grand ideas, usually involving cryptocurrency or some convoluted multi-level marketing scheme, and absolutely no follow-through. His portion of the rent when it arrived was a miracle, and when it didn't, it became my problem. He'd often saunter into the kitchen, a half-eaten bag of chips in hand, and casually mention some urgent, unforeseeable expense, usually followed by a hopeful glance in my direction. I'd make a mental note to check my dwindling savings and tell myself it was just temporary. It never was. Then there was Carolyn Rogers, 56F, my mother's oldest friend. She had moved in even earlier, after a bitter divorce left her emotionally shattered and financially precarious. Carolyn was quiet, almost invisible sometimes, flitting around the house with a perpetual air of fragility. She worked part-time at a local library, shelving books and dealing with overdue fines, a job that barely covered her meager personal expenses, let alone a significant share of the household bills. She had a habit of leaving passive-aggressive notes about dirty dishes or leaving the light on, but never actually confronted anyone directly. Her presence was a low hum of anxiety, a constant reminder of quiet desperation. I always felt a pang of guilt seeing her worn-out shoes by the door, knowing she often skipped meals to make ends meet. I picked up the slack for her too, of course. It was just easier than dealing with the alternative. My own life outside the house wasn't much better. I worked for a small boutique marketing agency, a place where the pretense of creativity barely masked the undercurrent of cutthroat competition. My boss, Marie Perez, 42F, was the epitome of entitled. She built her career on the backs of overworked, underpaid employees, all while waxing poetic about synergy and disruption. Marie was a whirlwind of designer clothes and impossible deadlines, her voice a sharp, demanding staccato that echoed through the open-plan office. She rarely remembered my name, usually addressing me as Petrov or the guy who handles the analytics. My job was to churn out reports, to crunch numbers, to make her look good, often pulling all-nighters for projects she'd take sole credit for. I was good at it, too good, which only cemented my position as her go-to workhorse. The email that Tuesday morning was from a solicitor's office in Glasgow. Regarding the estate of Alina Petrov, it read, my grandmother, my dad's mother. I hadn't seen her in person since I was a kid, maybe 10 years old. She'd moved back to Scotland after my parents divorced, a quiet, formidable woman who'd always sent me a birthday card with a crisp $20 bill inside, even when I was well into my 30s. I knew she was old, but the thought of her passing had always been a distant, abstract concept. The email was terse, professional, requesting my immediate presence for a reading of her will. My heart began to thud, a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I reread the subject line, then the body. It mentioned a substantial inheritance. Substantial. The word hung in the air, glittering, almost mocking. I went to work that day in a daze. The fluorescent lights of the office seemed harsher, the chatter louder. Marie was in one of her moods, pacing her office, barking orders into her headset. Petrov, my coffee. And I need those Q3 projections on my desk by noon, not a minute later, shed shriek. I nodded, a robotic movement, my mind still reeling. Substantial. What did that even mean? A few thousand? Enough to pay off my credit card debt? Enough to finally get Ryan to cover his share of the bills without me having to chase him for weeks? The next few days were a blur of nervous anticipation and quiet guilt. I told no one about the email. Not Ryan, who would immediately see it as his ticket to finance his next sure thing. Not Carolyn, who would likely just shrink further into herself, convinced she was a burden. And certainly not Marie, who would find a way to spin it into a new, unpaid task for me somehow. The idea of having money, real money, felt illicit, like a secret I had to protect. My phone rang constantly, but it was always work or Ryan asking for a small loan for emergencies that usually involved fast food or lottery tickets. I developed a skill for deflecting, for making myself seem just as broke as them. It was a self-preservation mechanism, one I'd honed over years of being the default provider. I booked a flight to Glasgow for the following week, using a few days of my precious annual leave. I lied to Marie, told her it was a family emergency, hoping she wouldn't press. She just waved her hand dismissively. Just make sure your work is covered before you leave, Petrov. No excuses. The lack of concern stung, but it was also a relief. The trip itself was surreal. Glasgow was cold, gray, and beautiful in its own way. The solicitor's office was imposing, all dark wood and hushed tones. I sat opposite a stern-faced woman named Ms. Macpherson, who spoke with a clipped accent that was hard to follow at times. She handed me a thick document, explained the legal jargon in painstaking detail. My grandmother Alina had been a shrewd investor, apparently. She had quietly built an empire completely unbeknownst to her estranged family. The total amount, it was astronomical. More money than I could ever have imagined in my wildest dreams. Enough to buy this entire building, Ms. Macpherson had said, gesturing around the grand office. My heart hammered. This wasn't just a few thousand, this was life-changing, generational wealth. I walked out of that office into the biting Scottish wind, feeling lightheaded, almost dizzy. The world seemed sharper, colors more vibrant. I had to sit down on a nearby bench just to steady myself. My first thought, predictably, wasn't about what I could buy for myself, but about them. Ryan, Carolyn, Marie, the people who in their own ways had sucked me dry financially and emotionally. The people I felt inextricably bound to. This money, this immense, unbelievable sum could free me. It could also, I realized with a sickening lurch, make me their ultimate mark. The flight back was agonizing. I kept replaying Ms. Macpherson's words, the numbers swirling in my head. I had access to it now. It was mine. But what would I do? The prospect of going back to the shared house, to the constant drain, the unspoken expectations, suddenly felt unbearable. The thought of Mari's entitled demands, of Ryan's endless schemes, of Carolyn's quiet despair. It was a suffocating blanket that I desperately wanted to throw off. When I landed, my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Ryan. Call me ASAP. Huge emergency. I sighed, a familiar weariness settling over me. I drove home, pulling into the narrow driveway, the house looking as dilapidated as ever. The porch light was flickering, a familiar symbol of deferred maintenance. As I unlocked the front door, the silence within felt heavy, foreboding. I could hear the faint murmur of the television from the living room. I walked in, my travel bag still slung over my shoulder, and found Ryan 60M and Carolyn 56F sitting stiffly on the couch. Ryan looked uncharacteristically grave, his usual easy smile replaced by a tight, anxious frown. Carolyn was wringing her hands, her eyes red-rimmed, looking even more fragile than usual. The air in the room was thick with tension, a palpable unease that made the hairs on my arms stand up. William, Ryan began, his voice unusually low, devoid of its usual bluster. He glanced at Carolyn, then back at me. We need to talk. My stomach dropped. I knew that tone. It usually meant trouble, big trouble. My mind raced, trying to anticipate the latest crisis. Had Ryan gambled away the rent money again? Had Carolyn lost her job? Whatever it was, it felt different this time, more serious. What's going on? I asked, dropping my bag with a thud that echoed in the quiet room. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't just anticipation anymore. It was a deep, gnawing fear. The inheritance was still a secret, a shield I hadn't yet deployed. But I could feel the walls closing in. Ryan cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. It's about the house, William, and us. Carolyn let out a small choked sob. My eyes darted between them. What about the house? I pressed, a cold dread spreading through me. Had we been evicted? Was there some sort of foreclosure? Ryan finally met my eyes, and his were filled with a strange mix of resignation and desperation. The landlord, he's selling. He wants us out by the end of the month. He paused, then swallowed hard. And Marie, she's decided to weigh in. My blood ran cold. Marie, how did she even know about this, and what did she have to do with it? This was a shared house, yes, but her involvement was completely unexpected. A new, sharper dread, entirely different from my earlier anxieties, began to curl in my gut. What about Marie? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ryan took a deep breath, looking utterly defeated. She's offering to buy the house, William. But only if, he hesitated, glancing at Carolyn again, who was now openly weeping. Only if it's just you, she said. She said she won't live with freeloaders. She gave us an ultimatum, William, her offer for the house or all of us out on the street, and she expects your decision by tomorrow morning. The words hung in the air, a cruel, impossible dilemma. The inheritance, the one thing that could solve everything, was still locked away in my silence. And now Marie, the entitled boss who barely knew my name, had somehow become the arbiter of my immediate future, holding not just my living situation, but the very fate of Ryan and Carolyn in her hands. The choice was clear, brutal, and demanded an immediate answer. My secret inheritance or my increasingly fragile family. I stood there utterly paralyzed, the echoes of Ms. Macpherson's words about my newfound wealth ringing hollow against the crushing weight of their desperation. My blood ran cold. Marie, how did she even know about this? And what did she have to do with it? This was a shared house, yes, but her involvement was completely unexpected. A new, sharper dread, entirely different from my earlier anxieties, began to curl in my gut. What about Marie? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ryan took a deep breath, looking utterly defeated. She's offering to buy the house, William, but only if. He hesitated, glancing at Carolyn again, who was now openly weeping. Only if it's just you, she said. She said she won't live with freeloaders. She gave us an ultimatum, William, her offer for the house or all of us out on the street, and she expects your decision by tomorrow morning. The words hung in the air, a cruel, impossible dilemma. The inheritance, the one thing that could solve everything, was still locked away in my silence. And now Marie, the entitled boss who barely knew my name, had somehow become the arbiter of my immediate future, holding not just my living situation, but the very fate of Ryan and Carolyn in her hands. The choice was clear, brutal, and demanded an immediate answer. My secret inheritance or my increasingly fragile family. I stood there utterly paralyzed, the echoes of Ms. Macpherson's words about my newfound wealth ringing hollow against the crushing weight of their desperation. The silence in the living room stretched, suffocating. Carolyn's quiet sobs were the only sound cutting through the shock. My mind was a whirlwind. Marie, the house, an ultimatum. This wasn't just about my comfort anymore, or even my ability to finally escape their gravitational pull. This was about their survival, or at least their immediate stability. She can't just do that, I finally managed to croak, the words sounding weak and pathetic even to my own ears. Ryan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the frayed carpet. She found out the landlord was looking to sell. She's been sniffing around for a while apparently, said she needs a pied-à-terre closer to the office. She made an offer the landlord liked, contingent of course on her not having to deal with, and I quote, your family's unfortunate dependents. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual bluster, and the defeat in it was chilling. Carolyn looked up, her eyes puffy and red. Don't know what we'll do, William. My job barely covers anything. Ryan. Well, you know Ryan. The unstated accusation hung heavy in the air. I knew better than anyone. I had enabled it, hadn't I? Every loan, every bill I'd quietly covered, every time I'd let Ryan off the hook for his share. I'd done it out of a misguided sense of obligation, out of fear of confrontation, and I realized with a fresh wave of self-recrimination, out of a perverse need to be indispensable. I had let them become dependent, and in doing so I had become dependent on their dependence. The inheritance, which had felt like a golden key, now felt like a lead weight. It was the solution, but how could I deploy it without exposing the very core of my secret existence? How could I explain having this vast sum of money while they had been struggling for so long, and I had done nothing but silently cover their deficits? The thought of revealing it now in this moment of crisis felt like a betrayal in itself. They would feel foolish, angry, perhaps even used. And Marie would surely find a way to leverage it, or worse, expect me to continue being her personal assistant from a position of wealth. I need a minute, I mumbled, my voice hoarse. I turned and walked into the small, cramped kitchen, the faint smell of stale cereal suddenly nauseating. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes, trying to clear the chaotic noise in my head. The ultimatum, Mari's offer, my secret, Ryan's desperation, Carolyn's despair, my own complicity, it all swirled together into an unbearable knot. I had always been the fix-it guy, the quiet problem solver, but this was different. This wasn't a leaky faucet or a late bill. This was their lives, this was my life. And for the first time, the path of least resistance, the path of quiet sacrifice, was no longer an option. It had led me here to this impossible precipice. I opened my eyes, staring at my reflection in the dark window. William Petrov, the quiet, self-sacrificing man, suddenly had the power to change everything. But power, I was learning, came with its own heavy burden. I had to choose, I had to act, and for once I wouldn't do it silently. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The time for secrets was over. Ryan, Carolyn, I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. They looked at me, their faces etched with anxiety and faint hope. I have something to tell you, something important. I saw the flicker of surprise in Ryan's eyes, the tentative relief in Carolyn's. It's about my grandmother, I began, and then slowly, haltingly at first, I laid out the truth of the inheritance. I watched their faces as I spoke, saw the disbelief, then the widening eyes, the dawning comprehension. Ryan's jaw dropped. Carolyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. When I finished, the silence was different this time. It was an astonished, disbelieving quiet. You inherited a fortune, Ryan finally managed, his voice a disbelieving whisper. And you didn't say anything. There was a hint of accusation there, but mostly shock. I know, I said, meeting his gaze. I didn't know what to do. It felt overwhelming, and then this happened. I gestured vaguely at the house. But now it changes things. I paused, taking another breath. This was the moment. This was where I stopped being the victim of my own self-imposed roles. I'm going to buy the house, Ryan, Carolyn, not Marie, I'm going to buy it. Their faces transformed, a mix of awe and relief washing over them. Carolyn burst into fresh tears, but these were tears of gratitude. Ryan for once seemed utterly speechless, his typical scheming mind completely derailed by the sheer magnitude of the announcement. But what about Marie? Carolyn stammered through her tears. And us? I looked at them, truly looked at them, and saw not just the burdens they had represented, but the people underneath, flawed and struggling, yes, but also terrified. And I saw my own part in the dynamic. Marie gets a firm no, I said, a surprising surge of defiance coursing through me. She can find another pied-à-terre. As for us, this is an opportunity for all of us. I took a step closer. I'll buy the house, yes, and we won't be out on the street, but this can't go on as it has been. Ryan, you need to find a way to contribute meaningfully, not just empty promises and big breaks, real steps. And Carolyn, you deserve more than just scraping by. We all do. This money. It's a chance for a new beginning, but it has to be a real one, no more enabling. No more quiet sacrifices for any of us. Ryan looked at me, a flicker of his old self-preservation returning, but then he saw the determination in my eyes. What does that mean, William? He asked, his voice subdued. It means we need to sit down, all of us, and figure out a real plan, I said. A plan for the house, for your futures, for my future. A plan that builds us up instead of dragging us down. It means responsibility from everyone, including me. The conversation was difficult, stretching late into the night. It wasn't a sudden transformation. Ryan was still Ryan, full of bluster, but I saw a new vulnerability in him. He admitted for the first time the crushing weight of his failures, the fear that he would never amount to anything. Carolyn, usually so reserved, opened up about her silent struggles, the shame of feeling like a burden, her quiet resentment at Marie's dismissive attitude. And I, for my part, admitted my own enabling, my fear of saying no, my misguided belief that being the silent provider was the only way to keep the peace. There were tears, raised voices, moments of quiet understanding. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was a beginning. A shared understanding, finally, of the deep-seated problems that had festered beneath the surface of our shared existence. We agreed that I would buy the house, putting it in a trust with conditions that protected my investment while providing security for them, contingent on their active participation in improving their own situations. For Ryan, that meant actively pursuing stable, gainful employment, not just speculative ventures. For Carolyn, it meant exploring options for a more fulfilling job, perhaps even further education, which I offered to help fund. It was a terrifying, exhilarating step. The next morning, I walked into Mari's office, a sense of quiet power I hadn't known I possessed radiating from me. She was barking orders as usual, her designer scarf askew. Petrov, did you get my message about the house? What's your decision? The landlord won't wait forever, and I have other properties in mind if you're going to drag your feet. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the all-powerful boss, but a demanding, insecure woman constantly seeking control. "Marie," I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through her usual bluster. "I have my answer. Thank you for your offer, but I will be purchasing the house myself, and not just for myself." Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then irritation. "What, Petrov, are you out of your mind? You can't afford that house, and even if you could, what are you going to do with those people?" She waved a dismissive hand. "And besides, who would do my Q3 projections if you're busy playing landlord?" I met her gaze, a strange sense of liberation washing over me. "I can afford it, Marie. As for those people, they're my family and we're working on a new arrangement. And as for your Q3 projections," I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You'll have to find someone else, Marie. I'm tendering my resignation, effective immediately." Her jaw dropped. Her face went from irritation to utter disbelief, then a slow, dawning fury. You can't," she spluttered. "Petrov, you're essential. I'll give you a raise, a bonus." I just shook my head. "No, thank you, Marie. My time here is done." I turned and walked out of her office, leaving her speechless, the silence a stark contrast to her usual cacophony. It was the most satisfying moment of my professional life. 2 weeks later, the house was officially mine. The paperwork had been daunting, but with Ms. Macpherson's efficient guidance, it had been surprisingly smooth. I had a mortgage, yes, but it was a fraction of what I could afford, and the rest of the inheritance was safely invested, providing a secure foundation. The atmosphere in the house had subtly shifted. It wasn't a complete overhaul overnight, but the tension had eased. Carolyn, with my encouragement, had started looking into online courses for paralegal work. She'd always been meticulous, organized, and quietly intelligent. The idea of a new career, one that paid a living wage and offered genuine challenge, seemed to energize her. She even volunteered to handle the household budget, something she'd always avoided, and approached it with a newfound seriousness. Ryan was a harder nut to crack. He was still Ryan, but the revelation of the inheritance and the very real ultimatum I had given him about his contribution seemed to have shaken him more profoundly than I had anticipated. He'd been quieter, less prone to grand pronouncements. He was attending interviews for real jobs this time, even if they were far below the executive positions he usually envisioned. I found him one afternoon actually cleaning the gutters, something he'd never done in all the years he'd lived here. He looked up, surprised, a faint flush on his face. "Just trying to do my part, William," he mumbled, avoiding my eye. It was a small thing, but it was a start. We'd also started having regular family meetings, something unheard of before. They were often awkward, sometimes contentious, but they were happening. We were talking, airing grievances, making plans. It was messy, but it was real. The constant hum of anxiety in the house was slowly being replaced by something else, something tentative and fragile, but undeniably hopeful. My own life was a whirlwind of change. I was no longer working for Marie, which was a liberation I hadn't truly appreciated until it happened. I was taking my time, exploring options, even considering starting my own small consultancy. The money gave me choices, real choices, not just theoretical ones. I was learning to say no, to set boundaries, not just with Ryan and Carolyn, but with potential clients, with friends, with myself. I was learning that self-sacrifice didn't make me a better person. It just made me resentful and enabling. A month had passed since I bought the house. One evening, I walked into the living room and found Ryan and Carolyn laughing, genuinely laughing. Ryan was recounting a particularly absurd job interview, exaggerating for comedic effect, and Carolyn was doubled over, wiping tears from her eyes. It was a sound I hadn't heard from them together in years. They paused when they saw me, their laughter dying down, a hint of self-consciousness. "William," Carolyn said, her voice still a little breathless. "Ryan was just telling me about a terrible interview." Ryan rolled his eyes, but a smile still played on his lips. "It was character building, William, that's what it was, character building." He even cleaned up his empty chip bag and put it in the bin without being asked. Small interactions like these were becoming more common. Carolyn had secured an entry-level position as a legal assistant, and while it wasn't her dream job, the stability and the prospect of upward mobility had visibly lightened her spirit. She was less anxious, more engaged, even started humming quietly as she cooked. She had bought herself a new pair of comfortable, sturdy shoes, a small but significant gesture of self-care. Ryan hadn't landed a big break yet, but he was working consistently as a freelance handyman, something he was actually quite good at. He even managed to contribute a modest but consistent sum to the household expenses, something I'd once thought impossible. He still had his moments of grandiosity, but they were tempered by a newfound realism, an understanding that consistent effort, not just grand schemes, was what truly counted. He still borrowed occasionally, but it was for practical things now, like tools or gas, and he always paid it back. My own perception of them had evolved. I saw Ryan not just as a financial drain, but as a man who had been deeply afraid of failure, whose bluster was a shield. And Carolyn, no longer just a fragile burden, was a resilient woman who had found her quiet strength and was actively pursuing a future for herself. They weren't perfect, and neither was I. We still had disagreements, moments of tension, but they were resolved through open communication, not silent resentment or enabling. The house, once a symbol of my entrapment, was slowly transforming into a true home, a shared space built on mutual respect and genuine effort. The constant pressure I used to feel had lessened, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. I realized that my self-sacrificing nature hadn't truly helped them. It had merely perpetuated a cycle. It was only when I asserted my own needs, set my own boundaries, and took active steps to change the dynamic that true growth for all of us became possible. The inheritance had been the catalyst, yes, the undeniable leverage, but the real work, the real transformation had been in the conversations, the uncomfortable truths, and the deliberate choices we had all made. I was still William, still quietly analytical, but I was also stronger, more assertive, and more authentically engaged in my own life and the lives of those around me. The path ahead wasn't perfectly smooth, but we were walking it together, each of us carrying our own weight towards a future that felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely bright.